A struggling single dad fixes a broken bike for a little girl in the park. Doesn't know her mom's a billionaire, hiding from a world full of fake love and shallow promises. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden haze across the park. It was the kind of late afternoon that made everything look a little more forgiving, where the breeze carried laughter and the grass shimmered like it hadn't been trampled by 100 tiny feet all day. Jake Mason sat on a worn wooden bench, sipping from a lukewarm thermos of coffee that had long since lost the battle against flavor. His son Max was somewhere in the sandbox, yelling about pirate treasure with a couple of neighborhood kids. Jake had just leaned back, eyes half closed, when a sharp metallic rattle cut through the hum of voices and birdsong. He looked up. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, was standing near the park path, staring down at her tipped-over bike. The chain had popped off, and her hands hovered uselessly, unsure what to do. She sniffled once, brushing a strand of hair out of her eyes. Jake stood without thinking, setting his thermos aside and heading over. "Hey there," he said gently, crouching beside the bike. "Looks like your ride gave up on you." The girl nodded, wide-eyed. "It was working fine, and then it just stopped." "Well, lucky for you, I'm pretty good with stubborn machines." He offered a small smile and glanced around. No adult in sight. "Your mom or dad nearby?" She pointed to a bench beneath a tree, where a woman sat with a book in her lap, watching them. Even from a distance, she looked polished, calm. The kind of person you'd expect to see stepping out of a black car, not reading in a park. Jake nodded and turned back to the bike. "All right, let's see what we've got here." His fingers moved quickly, years of experience guiding each adjustment. The chain was twisted, but nothing he hadn't seen 100 times before. Within minutes, the gears clicked back into place. "Try it now," he said, standing and brushing his hands off on his jeans. The girl hopped on and pedaled in a circle, beaming. "It works!" Jake smiled. "Told you." From across the park, the woman rose to her feet, her book forgotten. Jake barely noticed. He was too busy watching the little girl ride off, unaware that a moment this small was about to change everything. Jake dusted his hands on the sides of his jeans, the faint trace of grease streaking the already faded denim. The little girl had returned to her loops along the path, her laughter floating on the breeze, like music that didn't know it had an audience. He turned to head back to his bench, intending to finish his coffee and check on Max, but a voice stopped him, calm, clear, and unmistakably poised. "She really doesn't let anything slow her down." Jake turned and found himself face to face with the woman from beneath the tree. She had closed the distance quietly, almost gracefully. Up close, she was even more striking. Long, honey-brown hair, loosely tied back, eyes the color of green sea glass, and a presence that didn't beg for attention but somehow still commanded it. She wore a soft, tailored coat that looked more expensive than his truck, yet there was nothing showy about her. "No, she doesn't," Jake said with a nod, glancing toward the girl. "She did good staying calm, though. Most kids panic when their bike gives out." "She's a resilient one," the woman replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you for helping her." Jake shrugged. "Wasn't a big deal." It was to her, and to me. She extended a hand. "Claire Hawthorne." He hesitated only a second before shaking it. "Jake Mason." Her handshake was firm but not stiff, and there was something unreadable in her expression. Polite, sure, but also cautious. Like she was used to people expecting something from her. "You a local?" Jake asked, more out of curiosity than conversation. "Temporarily," she said, her eyes scanning the park before resting on her daughter. "We're taking a break from the city. Needed a little space. A little normal." Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Everyone had their reasons for needing quiet. He just nodded, letting the silence settle between them for a beat. "You fix bikes professionally, or is that just a hobby?" she asked. And though the question was casual, her tone carried genuine interest. "Mechanic," Jake said. "Mostly cars, trucks, whatever's falling apart." Claire smiled softly. "Well, I'm glad we ran into the right man for the job." Jake wasn't sure what to say to that, but for the first time in a long while, he found himself hoping this wasn't the last conversation they'd have. The morning sun had barely crested over the rooftops when Jake Mason shuffled into the tiny kitchen of his rented duplex, bleary-eyed and already behind. The coffee machine sputtered like it resented the early hour, and Max sat at the table swinging his legs, still in his pajamas, a piece of toast dangling from his mouth like it might escape. Jake opened the fridge and sighed. 3 eggs, half a jug of milk, and a wilting head of lettuce. Not exactly gourmet, but enough to patch together a lunch for Max. He grabbed a brown paper bag from the drawer, dropped in a peanut butter sandwich, a bruised apple, and the last granola bar. "Where's the juice box?" Max asked, tilting his head. Jake rubbed his neck. "Water today, buddy. Juice is on tomorrow's shopping list." Max didn't argue, just nodded and kept chewing. At 7, he seemed to understand more than most adults Jake had met. He didn't ask why Dad skipped breakfast or why the electric bill sat unopened on the counter. He just trusted that they'd be okay. Jake wasn't sure if that made him proud or quietly ashamed. By 8:00, Jake had dropped Max off at school and clocked in at Delaney's Hardware. The bell above the door jingled as the first customers came in. Mrs. Dobson needing light bulbs, a teenager looking for spray paint and pretending he wasn't. Jake greeted them all with the same polite nod, shoulders stiff from the cold and the weight of a dozen unpaid bills. The hours passed in a haze of sawdust, customer complaints, and worn-out boots. Every so often, Jake caught himself thinking about the woman from the park. Claire. The name had settled into his thoughts like a song he couldn't stop humming. He didn't know why. She was from a different world, hell, probably a different universe. But there was something about the way she watched her daughter ride that bike, like she was trying to remember what happiness looked like. When his shift ended, Jake pulled out his wallet and counted the bills: 3 tens, a 5, and some change. Enough for gas, maybe groceries if he skipped dinner. Again. Still, when he picked up Max and saw his son's grin as he waved his math test marked with a gold star, something inside Jake held steady. They had each other. That had to be enough. For now. The elevator glided silently up the private shaft, soft piano music echoing faintly off the marble walls. Claire Hawthorne leaned against the polished brass railing, eyes half closed, arms crossed over her chest like they could hold back the fatigue sinking deep into her bones. The gentle ding of the penthouse floor echoed like a sigh, and the doors opened to a world that looked perfect but felt anything but. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the sleek, modern space in the orange glow of the setting sun. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass, glittering like a promise that never delivered. Claire kicked off her heels and stepped onto the cold stone floor, her reflection following her in the spotless glass as she walked toward the kitchen. A housekeeper had already come and gone. Everything sparkled. The scent of expensive candles hung in the air fig and cedarwood, one of those combinations designed to smell like sophisticated warmth. But all it did was remind her how empty the place always felt. She poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the countertop, staring out over the city like it might offer answers. It didn't. Earlier that afternoon, she'd stood in a quiet park and watched a stranger kneel beside her daughter's broken bike. No cameras, no assistance, no pressure. Just a man who did the right thing without expecting anything in return. She hadn't felt that kind of quiet in years. The kind that didn't come from isolation, but from honesty. Claire's phone buzzed on the counter and she glanced at the screen. A text from Gregory Charming, arrogant Gregory, who'd taken her to 3 charity galas and managed to mention his stock portfolio during all of them. Dinner Friday? I got a table at Vianne's. You can thank me later, she didn't respond. She wasn't sure she even wanted to. It was always the same, smiles too rehearsed, compliments that felt like transactions. Men who looked at her like a prize, or worse, an investment. No one wanted her. They wanted the name, the empire, the story they could tell their boardroom buddies over scotch. Claire took a sip of wine and looked out again. In a city that sparkled from every angle, she'd never felt more invisible. But somehow, in a quiet little park, a man with grease on his hands and kindness in his eyes had managed to see her. It started with small glances, the kind that felt like coincidence, but lingered just long enough to make you wonder. Jake hadn't expected to see Claire again. Not really. After all, people like her didn't hang around places like Willow Creek Park. They passed through. But 3 days later, there she was, sitting on the same bench, a travel mug in hand, her daughter pedaling circles around the path, with Max right behind her, both of them shrieking with laughter. Jake approached cautiously, hands in his jacket pockets. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you were stalking me." Claire glanced up, a smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Or maybe you're stalking me." He chuckled. "I don't usually stalk people in broad daylight, but hey, if I'm breaking tradition." She laughed, then quiet, relaxed. The sound surprised him. It didn't sound rehearsed like so many of her smiles did. It was real. They settled into easy conversation as their kids looped past them over and over, Max's sneakers kicking up leaves while Sophie shouted directions like a general. It felt natural, the way their children gravitated toward each other, like they didn't need to think about differences, bank accounts, or the weight of adult histories. Over the next week, it happened again, and again. On Tuesday, Claire showed up with a blanket and a small thermos of cocoa, offering Jake a cup before he could even ask. On Thursday, they sat side by side on the swings while their kids built a fort from fallen branches. By Saturday, Jake brought an extra sandwich wrapped in wax paper, wordlessly handing it over while Claire pretended not to be touched by the gesture. They never talked about last names or what they did for a living. Claire liked it that way, liked being just Claire. Jake didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He didn't press when she fell quiet or when her gaze drifted too far into the distance. She didn't know what this was yet. Friendship? Curiosity? A slow unraveling of walls she hadn't realized were still standing? All she knew was this. Every time she saw him at the park, the city skyline felt a little farther away. And for once, she didn't mind. The afternoon sun filtered through the thinning autumn leaves, casting dappled shadows over the park bench where Jake sat with Claire beside him, their kids chasing each other through piles of brittle gold and orange. The air was crisp, laced with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Claire had her hair down today, something Jake hadn't seen before. Without the usual ponytail or sleek bun, it cascaded in loose waves past her shoulders, catching the light like strands of polished chestnut. She was mid-story something about Sophie trying to convince her that ketchup counted as a vegetable when a gust of wind swept across the path. A wayward strand of her hair whipped across her face, catching on her lips. She tried to brush it away with mild irritation, but it only tangled further, and the more she fought it, the worse it got. Jake leaned back, grinning. "Careful, that hair's trying to file for independence." Claire paused, hand frozen mid-swat. She blinked, then let out a laugh loud, unfiltered, and entirely unlike the polite chuckles he'd heard before. It startled her almost as much as it did him. "Sorry," she said between fits of giggles, finally taming the offending strands. "I don't usually look like a mess in public." "You look human," Jake said casually, watching Max and Sophie leap into a fresh pile of leaves. "It's an underrated look." Claire bit back another smile. "Do you always say things like that?" "Only when they're true." She turned toward him, studying his façonade in the assessing way people did when trying to measure status or value, but as if she were trying to memorize something fleeting. His eyes held a calm steadiness, a kind of honesty she wasn't used to. It made her feel oddly exposed, but not in a bad way. "You're different," she said almost to herself. "Been told that before," Jake replied with a shrug. "Usually by people who are walking away." But Claire didn't walk away. She stayed there on the bench, her laugh still echoing faintly in the breeze, and realized something she hadn't felt in a long time. Ease. Not the curated surface-level kind she'd grown so good at performing, but something real. It scared her, and it thrilled her. Back in the sleek offices of Hawthorne Industries, The windows stretched wide and unapologetic across the 39th floor, offering a panoramic view of the city Claire was doing her best to ignore. She sat at her desk, half listening to a quarterly report, while scrolling absently through a photo Sophie had drawn 4 stick figures beneath a crooked sun, labeled in bold crayon, "Me, Mommy, Max, and Jake." It made her smile. Then it made her uneasy. Across the room, Evelyn, her assistant of 8 years, observed her boss with a quiet intensity. Efficient to a fault and loyal in the way only someone highly paid to be could afford, Evelyn had noticed the change. The softer eyes, the silences filled with thoughts elsewhere. The missed meetings and rescheduled dinners. Claire was slipping into something unplanned and unvetted. When Claire stepped out for a call, Evelyn didn't hesitate. She opened her private laptop and began typing. Jacob Mason, mechanic, single father, widow, lives in Maple Hollow. It wasn't hard to find him. He wasn't hiding. No criminal record, no social media flair, no questionable online footprint. Just a quiet man raising a kid, working long hours at a hardware store, and fixing cars in a rented garage behind his modest house. But Evelyn dug deeper. A bankruptcy from 6 years ago, medical bills after his wife passed, overdue property taxes, a GoFundMe page started by a neighbor that hadn't raised much. On the surface, he was harmless. But that's what worried her. Evelyn leaned back, fingers steepled beneath her chin. She'd seen this before. A charming, grounded man appears just when a woman with too much money and too little trust starts craving something real. And real? Real had a price. She printed out the report and tucked it into a plain folder, sliding it beneath a stack of scheduling notes. She didn't plan to show it yet, but she would be ready. Claire returned moments later, her face flushed from the brisk rooftop call, a fresh smile tugging at her lips. "Sophie wants to invite Max over this weekend," she said, almost shyly. Evelyn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. I'll add it to your calendar." But inside, Evelyn was already calculating. Because love, in her experience, always came with fine print. The bell above the garage door jingled softly, a sound Jake barely noticed anymore. He was elbow-deep in the guts of a '94 pickup, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with oil, the smell of grease and dust heavy in the air. It was the kind of afternoon where time disappeared in the clink of tools and the rhythm of work until a shadow crossed the concrete floor, delicate and out of place. He glanced up. Claire stood just inside the open bay, framed by sunlight and holding something that didn't belong here, a single, slightly wilted rose. He blinked once, then twice. She was wearing jeans and a light sweater, not the kind of outfit you'd see in glossy spreads or boardrooms, but still somehow impossibly refined. Her hair was loose again, wind-tousled, and she looked more like a woman caught between errands than a billionaire heiress pretending to be ordinary. "I wasn't sure this was the right place," she said, glancing around at the chaos of parts and hanging tools. "But then I saw the truck out front with a bumper held on by hope and duct tape, and I figured, yeah, this is probably Jake's place." He smirked, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's not just duct tape, that's strategic reinforcement." Claire laughed, stepping forward and offering the flower. "Sophie picked this, said I had to bring it to you, because nice people deserve flowers too." Her words, not mine. Jake took the rose, surprised at the gentle way her fingers brushed his. "Well, tell her she's got good instincts." She hesitated, eyes sweeping across the cluttered space. "I just wanted to say thanks, for being kind, for showing up." Jake studied her a moment, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "Most people don't drive across town to say thank you. Most people don't fix broken bikes without asking for anything in return." They stood there, quiet stretching between them, not awkward but full, like a held breath waiting to become something more. Claire smiled, softer this time. "Anyway, just thought you should know. You're appreciated." Jake looked at the rose in his hand, then back at her. "That's more than I can say most days. And for once," Claire didn't feel the need to say anything else. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass and the faintest trace of barbecue smoke as Claire and Jake sat beneath the shade of an old oak, their kids just a few yards away, building an elaborate leaf city complete with pinecone towers and stick bridges. Max explained every detail with wild enthusiasm while Sophie listened like he was the most interesting person in the world. Claire sipped from a travel mug she'd brought, legs curled beneath her. "He's really imaginative," she said, nodding toward Max. Jake smiled faintly. "Always has been. When he was 4, he tried to convince me the moon was his real mom and we were just borrowing him." Claire laughed, caught off guard. "Sounds like he inherited your sense of humor." Jake shrugged. "Maybe. His mom was the smart one, though. And the brave one." Claire tilted her head, something in his tone shifting the air. "She doesn't come to the park with you?" Jake's eyes stayed on Max. "She passed. Cancer. A couple years ago." Claire's breath hitched, just slightly. "I'm so sorry." Jake nodded once. Not stiffly, not to shut her down, just acknowledgement. Like he'd said it so many times, it had become a part of his rhythm, but never any easier to carry. "She was everything," he said, after a pause. "Teacher, artist, the kind of person who remembered your coffee order after one conversation. We were young, but we figured out a life together. Then suddenly, it was just me and Max." Claire didn't speak right away. The park, so full of casual noise a moment ago, felt quieter now. She watched Jake's profile, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way he blinked longer than he needed to. He wasn't dramatic about it. He didn't need to be. The truth sat between them, plain and heavy. She reached for words and landed on the only honest ones. "You're doing a good job." Jake finally looked at her, meeting her gaze. "Some days it feels like I'm just trying to keep the wheels from falling off." Claire gave a soft smile. "Well, lucky for you, you're good at fixing things." He chuckled at that, a real laugh that softened the moment. But Claire wasn't laughing. She was watching him more closely now. Not because she felt sorry for him, but because something inside her had shifted. She'd met powerful men, brilliant men, charming ones. But this man? He'd been broken once. And he'd rebuilt himself, quietly, without applause. And that kind of strength didn't just catch her interest, it held it. Claire wasn't used to modest invitations, the kind that didn't come with engraved stationery, a formal dress code, or an agenda buried beneath polite small talk. So, when Jake had asked casually, almost like an afterthought, if she and Sophie wanted to come by for dinner, nothing fancy, just spaghetti, and maybe some bad jokes, she'd surprised herself by saying yes without hesitation. Now, standing in his small, lived-in kitchen, watching steam rise from a dented pot of boiling noodles, Claire felt something she hadn't in a long time: at ease. The place smelled like garlic and oregano, and a little like motor oil, but in a comforting, familiar way. Max and Sophie were in the living room, sprawled on the floor, surrounded by crayons, working intently on what they called a restaurant menu for dinner, even though spaghetti was the only item on it. Jake stirred the sauce with a wooden spoon that had seen better days, glancing over his shoulder. "I should warn you, this recipe's been in my family for generations, mostly because no one bothered to write anything down." Claire leaned against the counter, smiling. "If it has actual seasoning in it, you're already ahead of half the restaurants I've been to." He smirked. "Then prepare to be mildly impressed." Dinner was served on mismatched plates, drinks poured into glasses that may have once held jam. They ate at a small table with one leg propped up by a folded magazine, laughter threading through every bite. Claire couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed during a meal, really laughed. No cameras, no expectations. Just a man who made self-deprecating jokes about burning toast, and a boy who kept insisting he'd grow up to be both a superhero and a plumber. After dinner, the kids put on an impromptu restaurant review show, complete with accents and exaggerated gestures. Claire clapped and wiped tears of laughter from her eyes, her stomach full and her heart strangely lighter. When the evening wound down and the kids curled up together on the couch, Claire stayed behind to help Jake with the dishes. Their hands brushed once over the sponge. Neither pulled away. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. Jake looked at her, eyes steady. "Yeah, I kinda did." And she believed him. Because for once, it wasn't about impressing her. It was just about being real. And that meant more than any five-star dinner ever could. By Monday morning, the whispers had already begun to ripple through Maple Hollow like ripples across still water. It started at Marnie's diner, where gossip traveled faster than the coffee pot could be refilled. Lila, the waitress with a memory like a steel trap, spotted Claire stepping out of Jake's truck in front of the grocery store and nudged her coworker with a knowing grin. "That's her," she murmured, nodding toward the woman in the cream sweater and perfectly polished boots. "The one who's been meeting Jake at the park. You know, the fancy one." Word spread fast from there. By the time Claire reached the checkout line, 2 different people had greeted her by name, despite her never giving it. One offered her a free reusable bag on the house, and the other complimented her hair with just enough edge to suggest it wasn't entirely meant as kindness. Jake noticed it, too. When he walked into the hardware store for his shift later that day, Carl's owner raised an eyebrow and said, "Heard you had dinner with royalty this weekend." Jake blinked. "Excuse me?" Carl smirked. "You know, the tall one with the big eyes and the car no one in this town can afford. People are talking." Jake exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. Figures. In a town like Maple Hollow, things didn't stay quiet for long. Especially when someone as out of place as Claire Hawthorne kept showing up at the park with a kid who wore cashmere cardigans and called everyone sir or ma'am like she'd stepped out of a time machine. Some folks were curious, others skeptical. A few were downright rude. At the gas station, a man Jake barely knew made a crack about striking oil. And at school pickup, one mother leaned toward another and whispered, "She's not from around here," probably slumming it. But Jake didn't rise to it. He'd learned a long time ago that trying to explain yourself only made people dig deeper. Claire, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she just chose not to acknowledge it. Either way, Jake knew things were changing. And small towns had long memories, especially when it came to things they didn't quite understand. The air was crisp that evening, cool enough to coax jackets over shoulders and steam from coffee cups. Claire and Jake walked side by side along the edge of Willow Creek, their kids running ahead, collecting rocks and arguing about which one looked most like a dinosaur egg. They'd ended up here without planning to, another shared afternoon that bled into something quieter, something slower. Claire found herself watching Jake when he didn't know she wash his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his jaw set just enough to hint at thoughts he hadn't said aloud. "You're good with Max," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Jake looked over surprised. "Thanks." Claire hesitated, then asked, "Were you always this present?" He gave a soft laugh, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not at first." They stopped near the edge of the water, the fading light painting golden streaks across the surface. Jake crouched to pick up a flat stone, weighing it in his palm. When Melissa got sick, everything shifted. One minute we were planning vacations, and the next we were counting pills and pretending things weren't as bad as they were. Claire didn't speak. She didn't need to. She passed before Max turned 5. And suddenly, it was just me, trying to be everything at once. Mom, Dad, provider, bedtime storyteller. He skipped the stone once, twice. I messed up a lot, still do. But I figured out that showing up mattered more than getting it perfect. Claire's gaze softened. "You didn't have to do it alone." Jake shrugged. "Wasn't a choice, really. People mean well, but grief makes them uncomfortable. After the funeral, the casseroles stop, the calls fade. Life keeps moving, unless it's yours that stopped." The honesty in his voice pressed against something raw in Claire. She stepped closer, drawn to the quiet strength that didn't try to impress or perform. "He's lucky to have you," she said gently. Jake looked at her then, really looked. Sometimes I think I'm the lucky one. He keeps me moving forward, even on the days I feel stuck. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing more. But something unspoken passed between Thema thread pulling tighter, because grief recognized grief. And so did people who were still learning how to live again. The sky was streaked with rose gold as Claire and Jake walked the winding trail just beyond the park, a gravel path lined with tall grass and wildflowers clinging to the last warmth of autumn. The kids had been dropped off with a neighbor for the afternoon, giving them the rare luxury of uninterrupted conversation and silence that didn't feel awkward. Claire had taken off her coat and draped it over her arm, letting the breeze tousle her hair. Jake walked beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the path. They didn't talk much at first. They didn't need to. It was enough just being there. "Ever think about leaving Maple Hollow?" Claire asked after a while, not quite looking at him. Jake glanced her way. "Sometimes, but it's home. And Max, he needs roots, familiar faces. I get that now." She nodded slowly, fingers brushing a dried flower as they passed. "I used to think stability came from control. You know, keeping everything polished and managed. I spent so long trying to make things perfect I forgot what real felt like." Jake tilted his head. "You say that like you've lived 5 lives already." Claire smiled, but it was tight, uncertain. "Feels like it, some days." She stopped walking and turned to face him. Her heartbeat picked up, louder now in the quiet. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. Her voice was soft, but steady. "About me. About what I do. Who I am." Jake's brow creased, curious, but calm. "Okay." Claire opened her mouth. Words teetered on the edge of confession. The long hours, the board meetings, the last name plastered on headlines and stock tickers. The truth about the penthouse she retreated to, not a modest rental like she'd let him believe. How even her quiet days were curated escapes from the world she couldn't quite run from. But instead, she looked away. "I used to live very differently," she said, choosing each word like a tightrope step. "I thought that life would make me happy. It didn't." Jake studied her for a long moment. He didn't push. He just nodded once, like he understood more than she gave him credit for. "Sometimes a clean start is the bravest thing," he said simply. Claire smiled grateful, but guarded. She wasn't ready to take the mask off completely. Not yet. But for the first time, she wanted to. The rain came suddenly, like a curtain dropping over the world. One minute the sky was just moody and gray. The next it opened up in a downpour so fierce the streets disappeared beneath sheets of water. Thunder cracked low in the distance, and the wind swept across Maple Hollow with a force that turned umbrellas inside out and sent fallen leaves swirling like confetti. Claire and Jake had been grabbing dinner suppliessa. Simple errand turned soggy disaster when the storm hit full tilt. By the time they made it back to Jake's garage, they were soaked through, laughing breathlessly as they slammed the door shut behind them. "Well," Claire said, brushing dripping hair off her forehead, "I guess that's one way to wash the day off." Jake shook the rain from his jacket and tossed her a clean towel from a cabinet near the workbench. "Welcome to the 5-star accommodations." Claire looked around at the cluttered space. Tools hung in organized chaos along the walls, an old radio crackled from a shelf in the corner, and a plaid blanket was draped over a lumpy armchair like it had been there since the Reagan administration. And somehow, it felt warm, safe. Jake checked the forecast on his phone and grimaced. "Flooding on the road near the main strip. It might be a while." "How long is a while?" He looked up. "You okay with maybe being stuck here tonight?" Claire hesitated only for a second, then nodded. "Could be worse. You've got a roof." She wrapped the towel around her shoulders and sat on an overturned milk crate, while Jake rummaged through a drawer, producing 2 dusty mugs and a packet of hot cocoa meant for Max. He made it with water warmed on a plug-in kettle, handing her a cup like it was fine wine. They sat in the stillness, steam rising between them, the storm raging just outside. "Do you ever wish things were different?" Claire asked suddenly, her voice low. Jake considered the question. Sometimes. But then I think, if things had gone differently, I might not be here. Max might not be here. And you and I might still be strangers in a park. Claire met his eyes. You're not what I expected. Neither are you, he said. And this time, there was no smile behind it, just truth. The tension was quiet, but it pulsed between them like a heartbeat. Unspoken feelings. Half-formed confessions. The storm outside wasn't the only thing stirring, and neither of them seemed in a rush to escape it. The next morning, the storm had broken, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the pale sky and a garage smelling faintly of damp concrete and engine oil. Claire sat on the edge of the old armchair, Jake's flannel blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, sipping reheated coffee while Max and Sophie colored at the workbench nearby, trading crayons like seasoned diplomats. For a moment, it felt like something real normal, even. No headlines, no deals. Just laughter, the scratch of crayons on paper, and the hum of a space heater fighting off the chill. But reality never stayed quiet for long. Claire's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out and winced at the screen-saven missed calls and a flood of unread messages. And at the top, Evelyn, her assistant, her fixer, her lifeline to the world she'd been avoiding. She stepped outside, still barefoot, blinking into the hazy morning light as she pressed the phone to her ear. Claire, Evelyn's voice snapped through the line, sharp and urgent. I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. I needed space, Claire said quietly, watching a raindrop slide down the garage's rusted gutter. Well, the media's starting to take notice. You've canceled 3 public appearances, missed a shareholders' briefing, and now someone snapped a photo of you at a gas station barefaced, wearing flannel. It's on a gossip site. Claire closed her eyes. Of course it is. You told me you were taking a break. Not going off the grid with a mechanic in a town so small they still use paper library cards. The words stung not because they were wrong, but because they were too close to the truth. I didn't mean to disappear, Claire said. I just needed something that wasn't polished and pre-approved. Evelyn's voice softened, barely. I get that. But your life doesn't pause when you leave the room. The board is asking questions. Reporters are circling. If this continues, they'll start digging, and Jake Mason's name will come up. Claire swallowed hard. How long do I have? Days, maybe less. Claire hung up and stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon. Inside, Jake laughed at something Max said, a warm, genuine sound that made her heart ache, because the world she'd stepped out of was already clawing its way back in. And this life, the one that felt real, was on borrowed time. The sun was dipping low, throwing long shadows across the cracked pavement outside Jake's garage. He'd just finished replacing a timing belt on a rusted-out Corolla when he heard the familiar sound of boots crunching gravel. He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw her Lena. His late wife's sister stood with her arms crossed, eyebrows arched, the same wary expression she'd worn since the funeral. Dressed in jeans, a flannel jacket, and that always-present air of disapproval, she was as much a fixture of his life as the old tools lining the walls. You've been busy, she said, nodding toward the garage. And not just with cars. Jake raised an eyebrow, already knowing where this was headed. Hello to you too, Lena. She didn't smile. People talk, Jake. You and that woman. The one with the perfect hair and the boots that cost more than your truck. Jake tossed the rag onto the workbench and leaned against it. You came all the way here to judge my love life? I came because someone has to remind you how this town works, she snapped. You're a single dad fixing junkyard cars to keep the lights on. She's, what? Some mystery woman who doesn't even say where she's from? You really think she sticks around once she gets bored playing pretend? Jake's jaw tensed. It's not like that. Lena stepped closer. You're a good man, Jake. Too good to get hurt again. And Macshay doesn't need someone walking into his life if she's just going to walk right back out. Jake looked down at his grease-stained hands. then passed her toward the road, where the sky was beginning to blush with early evening. He'd heard this before, not just from Lena, but in the way people looked at him lately. Like Claire was a warning sign, not a possibility. "I'm not asking for permission," he said quietly. "And I'm not stupid. I know who I am. I know what I can't offer her." Lena sighed, her tone softening just a little. "Then protect your heart, Jake, and protect his." She turned and walked away, leaving the scent of old rain and rust behind her. Jake stood there for a long moment, staring at the place where she'd stood. He wasn't sure if Lena was wrong, but he also wasn't sure he cared. The fluorescent lights of the corner grocery buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in that slightly too bright, too honest glow that made imperfections impossible to ignore. Jake moved down the aisle with Max in tow, a shopping basket swinging from his calloused fingers, half filled with the usual macaroni, peanut butter. The off-brand cereal Max swore tasted better than the name brand. They were laughing about something Max's insistence that pickles counted as vegetables and should be eaten for dessert when Jake rounded the checkout lane and stopped, right there, on the magazine rack. Forbes, Women Who Move the World. Her face, Claire. Hair swept up into a sleek knot, lips painted in that perfect shade of power red, standing in front of a modern glass skyscraper with the headline blazing beneath her. Claire Hawthorne, Billions, Boardrooms, and the Burden of Inheritance. Jake stared. For a second, he thought it had to be someone else. A look-alike. A coincidence. But there was no mistaking those eyes. The same ones that crinkled at the corners when she laughed at his jokes. The same ones that softened when Sophie reached for her hand. He picked up the magazine with slow, almost hesitant fingers, scanning the spread. CEO of Hawthorne Industries. One of the wealthiest women in the country, known for her strategic mind and guarded public presence. And according to a small sidebar, currently on an extended sabbatical from public life. So, this was the truth. Or at least, the version she never offered him. "Dad?" Max tugged at his sleeve, breaking the spell. "You okay?" Jake swallowed hard, replacing the magazine on the rack like it might burn him. "Yeah, bud. Just surprised." He paid for their groceries without saying much, his mind a blur of questions, and a strange, tight feeling in his chest he couldn't shake. Back in the truck, Max munched on a cereal bar while Jake stared out at the rain-streaked windshield. She had lied. Not outright, but by omission. Let him believe she was just a woman looking for quiet. Not the kind who lived in penthouses and wore power like a tailored coat. The Claire he thought he knew was suddenly someone else entirely, and he had no idea what to do with that. The rain had started again, light and steady, tapping against the roof of the garage like it had something to say. Jake sat on a worn stool beside his workbench, elbows on his knees, the half-fixed carburetor in front of him forgotten. His mind wasn't on tools or repairs. It was on her. Claire Hawthorne, billionaire, CEO, public figure, liar. He'd spent the better part of the evening running the same thoughts in circles, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the money. He didn't care about that, not in the way people assumed. He didn't resent her for having more than he did. He resented that she had let him believe they were standing on equal ground when she'd been holding back the truth the whole time. Every smile, every moment on the park bench, every late conversation that felt like something real. Had it all been part of some experiment for her? A break from her high-rise life, slumming it with the local mechanic like it was some kind of retreat? He could hear Lena's voice in his head now, sharp and smug. "Told you so." A knock came at the side door, light but sure. Jake didn't need to look to know who it was. He opened the door anyway. Claire stood there, damp from the rain, hair pulled back hastily, eyes searching his face. She looked less like a billionaire and more like the woman who once laughed over burnt spaghetti in his kitchen. "Jake," she said softly, like the sound of his name might splinter if she wasn't careful. He didn't speak right away. Just stepped back, arms folded. "You saw the magazine," she guessed, her voice tight with guilt. "I did." "I wanted to tell you," she said. So many times. But I didn't know how. I didn't want to change what we had. Jake's eyes narrowed slightly. What we had? Claire, what we had was supposed to be honest. I am being honest. Now, he snapped. After I find out in a checkout line with my kid standing next to me. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension and hurt. I didn't lie to you, she whispered. No, Jake said, voice low. You just didn't think I deserved the truth. Claire flinched, eyes shining. But she didn't argue. She knew she had lost something important. And Jake didn't know if he could get it back. The late afternoon sky was overcast, casting a dull gray over Maple Hollow that mirrored the heaviness in Claire's chest. She stood outside Jake's garage, her coat pulled tightly around her, heart pounding like it might burst through her ribs. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, 100 times on the drive over, in the mirror, even out loud when Sophie wasn't listening. But now, standing just feet from the man she'd come to care for more than she ever intended, the words didn't feel strong enough. Jake was already at work when she arrived, wiping down the hood of an old Ford with the kind of focus that meant he was trying not to think. He looked up as she approached, expression unreadable. Not angry. Just closed. I need to talk to you, Claire said, stepping into the garage, her heels tapping softly against the concrete floor. You already said everything, Jake replied without looking at her. Or didn't, depending on how you look at it. I should have told you who I was, she admitted, voice trembling slightly. But I didn't come here to lie. I came to breathe, to be somewhere I didn't have to pretend. Jake set down the rag slowly. And yet you kept pretending, even when I let you in. I wasn't pretending with you, she said, stepping closer. Everything I share. Everything. We felt that was real, was it? His voice was quieter now, but harder, because I thought we were building something. Turns out I was just a detour, a nice break from your real life. Claire's breath caught. That's not fair. Jake finally looked at her, and it nearly undid her. There was pain in his eyes, but beneath it, something more brutal insecurity. Not about her money, but about his place in her world. You belong in a world I can't touch, Claire, he said softly. And you never gave me a chance to decide if I could live in it. You made that decision for me. I was scared, she admitted. I didn't want to lose what we had. Well, Jake said, picking up the rag again, looks like you lost it anyway. Claire stood frozen. She wanted to fight for it, wanted to push back, to beg him to see her, not her last name, but something in his voice told her this wasn't a moment for persuasion. It was a wall, and it was solid. She turned, blinking hard against the sting behind her eyes. Goodbye, Jake. He didn't answer, and the silence that followed her out the door was colder than the wind at her back. Max sat cross-legged on the floor of Sophie's bedroom, a crayon clutched in one hand and a serious expression on his face. Across from him, Sophie furrowed her brow in concentration, flipping through a notebook filled with scribbled plans, glitter stickers, and very questionable spelling. A stuffed giraffe sat between them, watching silently as if overseeing the entire operation. This has to work, Sophie said, tapping the page. My mom's been really sad. She keeps staring out the window like she's in a movie. Max nodded solemnly. Dad's been weird too. He burnt the grilled cheese twice this week. That's how you know something's wrong. They both sighed, then looked down at the paper, between them titled, Operation Fix Everything. Underlined. Twice. The plan had 3 parts. Make them bump into each other. Make them talk. Let the magic happen. Okay, Sophie said, standing up and pacing. What if we invite both of them to the park at the same time, but don't tell them the other one is coming? Max's eyes lit up. And we pretend it's our idea, like we just wanted a playdate. That way they can't say no. Exactly, Sophie said, grinning. And maybe we bring snacks. Adults are less grumpy when they're eating. They high-fived, a little too loudly, and Sophie's mom called up the stairs. Everything okay? Up there? Just saving the world? Sophie yelled back, and Max covered his mouth to stifle a laugh. They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully crafting 2 invitation drawn notes with crooked hearts and misspelled names, one for Claire, the other for Jake. Each one included a time, a location, and a big red "Please come" at the bottom. They didn't understand boardrooms or heartbreak, or why grown-ups made everything harder than it had to be. But they understood this. Their parents were better when they were together. Happier, lighter. Like puzzle pieces that didn't quite know they fit until they clicked. So they folded the notes, sealed them with dinosaur and butterfly stickers, and made a promise, pinkies intertwined. If grown-ups forgot how to fix things, maybe kids had to remind them. The marble floors echoed under Claire's heels as she moved through the cavernous quiet of her penthouse. The lights were low, the curtains drawn back to reveal the glittering skyline beyond sharp towers glowing like stars that never rested. Below, the city pulsed with energy. Inside, everything was still. Too still. She set her handbag on the entryway table, the soft thunk of leather sounding almost too loud in the emptiness. A housekeeper had left the place immaculate, flawless pillows, spotless surfaces, fresh flowers arranged in perfect symmetry, but nothing felt lived in. Nothing felt real. Claire kicked off her shoes and wandered barefoot through the space, one hand trailing along the smooth edge of the kitchen island. There was no smell of garlic in the air. No laughter in the next room. Just silence and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Sophie had fallen asleep in the car on the way back from her friends. She was upstairs now, tucked into bed, surrounded by plush pillows and fairy lights. Claire had kissed her forehead and whispered goodnight, like always. But even that felt thinner somehow. Hollow. She moved to the living room and sank into the oversized sectional, pulling a cashmere throw over her legs. Her phone lit up beside her 2 new emails, a board summary, and a message from Gregory. Dinner Friday? Private room at Dante's. Let's pick up where we left off. She turned the screen face down. All her life, she'd been surrounded by everything. Luxury, security, applause, men who knew her title but not her heart, rooms full of people who smiled too wide and left as soon as the cameras were gone. She had built this life, curated it down to the last polished corner. And now? Now she'd give it all up for a cramped kitchen with mismatched plates, a boy who loved dinosaurs, and a man who looked at her like she wasn't a brand but a person. Claire blinked hard, the tears coming quietly. Not for the rejection, not for the lie she'd been caught in, but because for the first time in her very polished, very managed life, she missed something that money couldn't replace, and she wasn't sure how to get it back. The garage was quiet, save for the occasional clink of a wrench or the low hum of an engine turning over. Jake stood over the open hood of a beat-up Chevy, sleeves rolled up, hands moving on autopilot. The engine needed work timing belt, maybe a new water pump, but his focus kept drifting, like a radio stuck between stations. He tried to shake it off. Work had always been his anchor. When Melissa got sick, when the bills piled up, when Max cried in the middle of the night, fix things, with his hands, with his silence, with the rhythm of doing something that made sense. But Claire didn't make sense. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders. The mug she'd used sat on the shelf, untouched, still faintly scented with cocoa and cinnamon. Her laugh had once echoed off these walls. Her voice is soft, curious, too smart for someone trying so hard to be ordinary still, lived in the corners of this space. Jake wiped his hands on a shop rag, letting out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He glanced at the chair she'd sat in that rainy night. Flannel blanket still draped over the arm. Part of him wanted to throw it away. Another part couldn't bring himself to move it. Max had noticed the shift, too. He was quieter lately, drawing more, asking fewer questions. As if, even at 7, he knew not to poke the wound his dad was trying to ignore. Jake picked up a socket wrench and turned back to the engine, forcing himself into the work. Focus, tighten, replace, repeat. But every time he blinked, he saw her, standing at the door, soaked from the rain, smiling in the park, barefoot on the trail. Looking up at him with guilt in her eyes, honesty just a second too late. He wasn't angry anymore. Not really. Just tired. Tired of pretending he didn't care. Tired of acting like the version of his life before her had been enough. But what could he do? She was gone, back to a world he'd never belonged to. And he was just a man in a garage, waiting for a heart he wasn't sure would ever come back. Claire sat at her writing desk just past midnight, the city's glow filtering through the sheer curtains like distant stars too far to touch. Her laptop sat closed beside her, ignored. The world of board meetings, headlines, and strategy could wait. Tonight, she needed something slower, quieter, real. A blank sheet of ivory stationery lay in front of her, and her pen hovered just above it. She hesitated, then began to write, not like a CEO, not like a woman used to being guarded and polished, but like someone who missed a man she had no right to. Jake, I don't know how to begin this without sounding like I'm still hiding something. I'm not. Not anymore. She paused, breathing through the sting behind her eyes. You once said showing up matters more than getting it perfect. I didn't show up for you when it counted. And I'm sorry for that. I should have told you who I was the first time we sat on that bench. I should have trusted you with all of it. My name, my world, the parts I hate and the ones I still haven't figured out. But the truth is, I didn't want you to look at me the way everyone else does. I wanted to know what it felt like to be just Claire. And with you, I did. She let the pen still, the ink glistening faintly in the soft lamplight. Her throat tightened. You once said grief teaches you how to move forward. I think maybe love does too. Even the kind that doesn't last the way we want it to. You are a better man than I ever expected to find in a quiet town with a leaky garage and a heart too big for the life around it. You made me laugh again. You made me want things I thought I'd outgrown. You made me feel like I could be more than my last name. If nothing else, thank you for that. She signed it without flourish. Claire then she folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and placed it in the drawer of her desk. Not sealed, not stamped, just waiting. She stared at it for a long time, but when morning came, the letter remained unopened. A truth, too late. A message meant for someone who might never hear it. The sun was just beginning to dip below the rooftops, casting long golden shadows across the quiet streets of Maple Hollow. The air was warm for early spring, filled with the scent of budding trees and the soft chirp of crickets beginning their evening chorus. Sophie gripped the handlebars of her bike tightly, her tiny face set with determined focus. The pink helmet wobbled slightly on her head, her cheeks flushed from the ride. She'd studied the route on her tablet, traced the roads from her house to Jake's garage, and memorized every turn. She hadn't told her mom. Not because she wanted to be sneaky, but because grown-ups made things complicated, and Sophie didn't have time for complicated. Not when her mom had been quiet and sad all week, and Max said his dad was weird now, like when the dog ran away. So she was fixing it, or trying to. She'd made it 5 blocks before the chain slipped. Again. The pedals jammed, the back wheel locked, and the bike tipped just enough to throw her off balance. Sophie yelped as she hit the ground, scraping her knee hard against the pavement. Tears sprang to her eyes, more from frustration than pain. She sat there for a moment, lip trembling, trying not to cry. "It's just a scrape," she muttered to herself. "You're tough." But the bike wouldn't budge. The chain hung loose, dangling like a sad little vine. She looked around. No houses she recognized. No one in sight. She sniffled once, and then did what any smart little girl would dosh. Pulled out the crumpled envelope from her backpack. Operation Fix Everything, still marked with butterfly stickers and smeared glitter. Her backup plan. She opened it and looked at Max's drawing Jake's garage, crooked and charming, with stick figures standing out front. One tall, one medium, one small. A family. She took a deep breath and stood, brushing dirt from her leggings. She couldn't fix the bike, but she could walk the rest of the way, because she wasn't giving up. Not on Max, not on Jake, not on her mom, and maybe not on love either. The sun was sliding behind the trees when Jake closed up the garage for the night. his hands still stained with grease and his thoughts drifting, as they always did lately, toward Claire. He hadn't seen her in over a week, but her silence filled the space like a ghost stone that knew how to haunt without making a sound. He was locking the side door when he spotted something small and out of place down the road. A figure, limping. Jake squinted. It was a little girl. No Sophie. She was walking slowly along the shoulder, pushing a crooked pink bike with one hand and clutching her knee with the other. Her helmet dangled from the handlebars, one sneaker dragging slightly. Even from a distance, Jake could see the tear tracks on her cheeks, streaked into the dust on her face. He dropped his keys. "Sophie?" he called, already jogging toward her. "What happened?" She looked up, startled at first, then relieved. "Jake?" He was beside her in seconds, crouching to examine her scraped knee. Blood had dried around the cut, not too deep, but enough to sting. Her bike was hopeless. The chain had slipped, the pedals jammed, one handlebar bent at an awkward angle. "I was coming to find you," she said, her voice wobbling. "To fix things. Me and Max had a plan." Jake's heart twisted. "You walked all this way alone?" "I wanted to talk to you. Mom's been so sad, and I thought, if I just got here—" Her voice broke. "I didn't think it would hurt so much." Jake scooped her up gently, bike forgotten for now. "You're okay. I've got you." She clung to his neck, small arms wrapping around him with the kind of trust that shattered walls. Back at the garage, he cleaned her cut and gave her a juice box from the mini fridge. Max would have called it a first aid snack. Sophie sat quietly, watching him. "Are you mad at my mom?" Jake paused. "No, just hurt." "She didn't mean to lie," Sophie said. "She just forgot how to be brave. I think maybe you forgot too." Jake didn't answer. But something shifted in him, a crack in the armor. Because standing there, holding a hurt little girl who believed love could be fixed with crayons and bike rides, Jake Mason realized something. He wasn't angry anymore. He was still in love. Claire's car screeched to a stop just outside the garage, gravel spitting from beneath the tires as she flung the door open and ran. Her heart was thudding so hard it made her chest ache, her breath shallow with panic. "Sophie!" she shouted, voice cracking as she scanned the dusk-darkened lot. Then the door to the garage opened, and there they were, Jake standing in the glow of a single overhead light. Sophie sitting on the workbench beside him with a juice box in hand, her scraped knee bandaged and clean. Safe. Alive. Claire staggered toward them, her heels forgotten somewhere in the car, her coat flapping behind her. Jake stepped forward, his voice calm. "She's okay. She found me a few blocks away." Claire reached for Sophie, pulling her into her arms, holding her too tightly, tears rushing hot and fast. "Oh my God, I thought I lost you." "I'm sorry," Sophie mumbled. "I just wanted to fix everything." Claire kissed the top of her head, breath hitching. "I know, baby. I know." Jake gave them space, but his eyes never left Claire's face. She looked up at him over Sophie's shoulder, face pale, mascara smudged from crying on the drive. "She left a note," he said gently. "Said she was coming to find me. You raised a determined one." Claire managed a soft, shaky laugh, brushing Sophie's hair back. "She gets that from me, unfortunately." A few minutes later, with Sophie tucked under a blanket inside the office, sipping warm cocoa, Claire stepped onto the porch of the garage where Jake stood, watching the sky fade from purple to navy. "I owe you more than thanks," she said quietly. Jake didn't move. "You owe me the truth." Claire nodded, stepping closer. "Okay, here it is." She took a breath, one that carried years of pressure behind it. "My name is Claire Hawthorne. I run one of the largest family-owned companies in the country. People see me as the brand, the wealth, the reputation. Not a person, never a person." Her voice caught, but she pushed on. "I left that world for a while because I couldn't breathe in it anymore. I didn't come here to lie. I came here to feel normal, to remember who I am." Jake was silent, watching her. She met his eyes, raw and unguarded now. "I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted something real. And you felt like the most real thing I've had in years." The quiet between them stretched like a thread pulled taut. "I was scared," she whispered. "Not of being found out, but of losing you the second you knew the truth." Jake looked down, hands in his pockets, his voice low. "You almost did." Claire's lip trembled, but she stood her ground. "I'm still here." And for the first time since she arrived, she wasn't holding anything back. The night had settled over Maple Hollow in a hush, the stars just beginning to appear, scattered and soft above the trees. Jake leaned against the wooden post of the garage porch, the rough grain pressing into his back as he stared out into the dark. Claire stood beside him, her arms folded not defensively, but tightly, like she was trying to keep everything from spilling out again. Inside, Sophie had fallen asleep, curled up under a fleece blanket, Max snoring softly beside her. The glow of the old desk lamp cast a warm light through the window, like a snapshot of a family that almost existed. Jake exhaled slowly. "You know, I used to think love meant being the strong one, the steady one, the provider." Claire said nothing. She let the silence make space. "But after Melissa died, I started to realize love's a lot messier than that. Sometimes it's just showing up with peanut butter sandwiches, or pretending you know how to braid hair, or trying to look your kid in the eye and act like you're not terrified every time a bill comes through the door." He paused, then glanced at her, eyes shadowed. "So when you walked into my world, into our world, I felt like I'd been handed something I didn't earn, like it wasn't mine to hold." Claire's brow creased. "Because of who I am?" "Because of what I'm not." That confession hung there, unguarded and vulnerable, and Claire stepped forward, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the weight in his shoulders. "Jake," she said softly, "do you really think I care about what kind of car you drive, or how big your house is?" He didn't answer. She reached out, her fingers curling around his hand, grease-stained and scarred from years of work. "You showed up for me when I didn't even know how to ask. You cared about Sophie like she was your own. You made me laugh when I forgot how. That is the kind of rich people spend their whole lives chasing." Jake looked down at her hand wrapped in his, like he wasn't sure he deserved it. "You are more than enough," she said. "Not in spite of who you are. Because of it." And for the first time in a long, long while, he started to believe it. The moon hung high over Maple Hollow, soft and full, casting silver light across the quiet lot outside Jake's garage. The crickets had started their nightly chorus, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of springtime grass and distant wood smoke. It was the kind of night that asked nothing, only offered stillness. Claire sat on the porch steps, her arms draped loosely over her knees, the cool wood beneath her grounding and real. Jake joined her without a word, settling beside her in the dark. Neither spoke for a while. They didn't have to. Inside, through the cracked office window, Max and Sophie lay curled together on a worn-out couch, a blanket tucked to their chins, their small, steady breathing the soft metronome of a world finally at peace. Claire glanced over at Jake, his face turned upward to the stars. "They're beautiful tonight," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Always are when you stop running long enough to notice." She smiled faintly, the words slipping out before she could hold them back. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you." Jake turned to her slowly. "I know. I thought if I told you the truth, everything would fall apart." He gave a quiet chuckle. "Newsflash, it kind of did." Claire bit her lip. "But you stayed, even after everything." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I think, deep down, I always knew you weren't running from something. You were trying to run to something. You just didn't know what it looked like yet." The wind stirred, gentle, like it didn't want to interrupt. Claire shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his. "Do you forgive me?" she asked, the question soft but sharp in its vulnerability. Jake reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Yeah," he said simply. "I do." They sat there, bathed in moonlight, surrounded by the quiet breathing of children and the soft hum of a small town at rest. Nothing flashy, nothing scripted. Just two people who had messed up come clean and somehow found each other again. And in that silence, in that stillness, forgiveness settled over them like a blanket. Not rushed, not forced. Just real. The sun was just beginning to set, casting the sky in a warm blush of gold, and rose as Claire spread out a thick plaid blanket beneath the old oak tree at Willow Creek Park. A soft breeze tugged at her hair, and she laughed quietly to herself as she set down the small picnic basket, trying to remember the last time she'd gone on a date that didn't involve polished menus and polished people with rehearsed smiles. This was different. This was real. Jake arrived a few minutes later, a paper bag in one hand and that familiar crooked grin tugging at his lips. He wore a button-down shirt that was clearly older than he'd admit, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and jeans clean enough to say he'd tried. The moment their eyes met, that nervous flutter hit Claire's stomach unexpected and genuine. "I hope you weren't expecting candlelight and a wine list," Jake said, holding up the bag. "Because all I've got is a thermos of lemonade and the world's most lopsided sandwiches." "Perfect," Claire said, sitting cross-legged as he lowered himself beside her. "Honestly, anything not followed by a dessert with gold flakes feels like a dream right now." He handed her a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and poured lemonade into mismatched mugs he'd brought from home. They ate with the easy rhythm of people who'd already shared too much to pretend. There were no white tablecloths or camera flashes, just laughter and stories and the soft rustle of leaves above them. "First date," Claire mused, sipping from her mug. "And no one's trying to impress anyone," Jake smirked. "Speak for yourself. I ironed this shirt." Claire laughed, the sound light and open, her head tilting back. "Well, then I'm very impressed." They talked until the stars blinked alive overhead, Sophie and Max playing in the distance under the soft hum of park lights. When the conversation dipped into silence, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of everything unspoken, everything still unfolding. Jake reached over, gently brushing a strand of hair from Claire's face. "You know, if this is what dating looks like now, I think I'm okay with it." She leaned in just enough. "So am I." And under the stars, on a blanket that smelled like fabric softener and grass, their first real date ended not with applause or champagne, but with a kiss that felt like a beginning. The studio lights were warm but blinding, the kind Claire had grown used to over the years, cameras, carefully framed shots, and the hush of a crew trained to catch every nuance. But tonight felt different. This wasn't a shareholder meeting. This wasn't a brand strategy reveal. This was her. Claire sat across from the host of Evening Focus, a national spotlight segment known for high-profile interviews. She wore a simple navy dress, no designer label, her hair in soft waves around her shoulders. The makeup was minimal. The mask was gone. "So," the host began, voice smooth and practiced. "After months away from the public eye, Claire Hawthorne reappears, quieter, softer, and, if I may say more herself. What changed?" Claire smiled gently, not dodging the question. "Perspective," she said. "I stepped away from boardrooms, from noise, from expectations, and I found something I didn't know I was looking for." The host leaned in, intrigued. "There's been a lot of speculation. Were you in hiding? Burned out? Was this a retreat? Or a reckoning?" Claire paused, then said calmly, "It was a reset. I spent time in a small town. I spent time being normal, or at least as close to it as I've ever gotten. I met people who didn't know my last name, and they treated me like a person, not a headline." "And is it true," the host asked with a glint in her eye, "that one of those people was a mechanic?" Claire laughed softly, not embarrassed, not guarded. "Yes, a mechanic, a single father, a man who reminded me what integrity looks like when no one's watching." The studio went still. "Sounds like a romance novel," the host quipped. Claire met her gaze. It felt like one, but realer. Messier, and better. There was a pause, and then Claire continued. I'm not walking away from my company, but I'm done living a life I don't recognize. I used to think power was measured in wealth and strategy. Now I know it's measured in choice, and I choose honesty. I choose stillness. And I choose the people who see me know the name, not the brand, just me." The host smiled, then leaned back. Claire Hawthorne, ladies and gentlemen. A woman rewriting her own story. And as the cameras clicked off, Claire knew she hadn't just changed the narrative. She'd finally taken it back. The ribbon fluttered in the morning breeze, bright red and perfectly tied across the entrance to what had once been a shuttered warehouse at the edge of Maple Hollow. Now it was something else entirely. The Hollow Community Hub. Fresh paint, open windows, and a sign out front that read, "Free bike repairs, kids welcome." Jake stood near the entrance with Max, holding a pair of scissors and still trying to wrap his head around how all this had come together so quickly. New tools lined the workshop wall inside. A small kitchen had been added. There was even a reading nook with bean bags and donated books. Everything was clean, welcoming, needed. The mayor had offered him the chance to cut the ribbon, said something about community spirit and good men who fix more than engines. Jake had smiled, but he couldn't take credit. Not really. He hadn't paid for this. He hadn't even asked for it. He only found out the truth a week earlier, when the contractor let it slip. That city woman sent the funds. Quiet type, but she knew what she wanted right down to the bike racks. Claire. She hadn't said a word. No plaque, no press release, no spotlight, just a gift. One that changed the entire town. Jake glanced over the growing crowd, families, neighbors, kids already circling the lot on bikes with loose chains and wobbly tires. Sophie and Max ran side by side, laughing like they owned the place. And maybe, in a way, they did. Claire stood at the edge of it all, in jeans and a soft sweater, arms crossed, sunglasses perched atop her head. She hadn't come forward. She stayed back, watching it unfold, letting him be the face of it. He walked over to her quietly, stopping just beside her. "You weren't going to tell me, were you?" he asked. She smiled, eyes on the kids. "It wasn't about me." Jake studied her a moment. "You know, you're kind of terrible at letting people say thank you." Claire turned to him then, a soft laugh escaping. "Guess I'll just have to get used to it." He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together as the mayor called for attention. And just like that, under a banner that read "Wheels of Change," something bigger than either of them had begun. The park hadn't changed much. The same weathered benches lined the path, the same towering oak stretched its arms over the playground, and the same gentle breeze rustled the leaves just enough to whisper that summer was fading. But for Jake and Claire, everything felt different. They walked hand in hand along the trail, watching Sophie and Max race ahead on their bikes, laughing as they darted in and out of golden sunlight. Claire wore her hair down, loose and windblown, and Jake had his toolkit slung over one shoulder just in case. It had become something of a ritual. Weekend rides, quiet walks, the simplicity of time that no longer felt borrowed. The world still spun fast beyond Maple Hollow, but here, it slowed just enough to catch your breath. As they rounded the bend, they spotted him, a boy, maybe 8 or 9, crouched beside his tipped-over bike at the edge of the trail, one pant leg torn at the knee, cheeks flushed with frustration. His chain had slipped off. Classic. Claire and Jake exchanged a glance, the kind that didn't need words. They were already moving before the boy could even look up. "Need a hand?" Jake asked, crouching beside the bike. The boy sniffled. "I think it's broken." Jake smiled. "It's not. Trust me, I've seen worse." Claire knelt beside him, offering a bottle of water from her bag. "What's your name?" "Lucas," the boy mumbled. "My mom's over there. She doesn't know yet. I didn't want her to freak out." Claire looked across the field and spotted a woman juggling a toddler and a phone, clearly overwhelmed. She smiled gently. "We've all been there." Within minutes, the bike was upright, the chain back in place, and Lucas was beaming like he'd just won a race. He took off toward his mom, pedaling hard, yelling something about the bike doctor and his wife. Claire raised an eyebrow at Jake. "Wife?" he smirked. "You heard the kid." They turned back toward the path, fingers finding each other again. And as they walked, Claire, the billionaire, who came looking for peace, and Jake, the mechanic who taught her how to feel it, they passed by the same bench where it all began. Full circle, but just the beginning.